Austin has an affordability problem and there are solutions, but will our city council take the necessary steps to fix these issues? I interviewed Chris Afffinito with Heartwood Real Estate and we dive into this. Do me a favor, like and subscribe for future comments and let me know in the comments what you think about this conversation. Today we're here with Chris Afffinito with Heartwood Real Estate and we're going to jump into some of the big issues in Austin that we're seeing with development and density and all of that. But before that, you will tell us a little bit about where you came from, where you went to school, and how you got to Austin and where in this business.
Sure. I grew up in New Jersey, about 45 minutes from New York City. I went to school from undergrad at Villanova, which is in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I was a real estate and finance major there. When I graduated, I went back to New York City and I worked for KPMG for a little while, which is a big accounting firm, but I did commercial real estate valuation for them, basically appraisal. I hated that, so I got out and I moved over into real estate development. And
what would you graduate in?
My major?
Yeah.
In finance and real estate.
Okay, gotcha.
Mm-hmm. And so then when I left KPMG, I ended up working for an office developer. And so mostly office, some, like retail, but I was the person in charge of, finding new deals and finding a capital partner for those deals and doing all the financial analytics and things like that. That was going great. I loved it. It's what I do now. So.
So let me ask you this. I've noticed that a lot of people, when they enter commercial, that they're in finding new deals. Is that kind of like as you're super young and you're actually like burning up the phones?
Not necessarily. I mean, I've run into some people in the acquisitions field where for one reason or another their firm or they feel like they need to. The only way to find something worth doing is to find something off market.
Yeah,
and that's never been. That's never been the way I've thought about it. I mean, to me, it's like cast a wide net, right? So
yeah.
You network with the brokers, right? It's like real estate agents. It's good to network with each other for certain reasons. It gives you more in-depth market knowledge. Things will just start coming to you.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the approach that I've taken is network and let things come to you, not hit the phone and call everybody that's, getting 10 calls a week from people asking to buy their property.
Yeah. And you were evaluating the properties for them. Mm-hmm. That's where I've done some evaluating with you on some properties. You were good at it. Did you learn a lot of that from them?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I was basically an appraiser for commercial real estate. So that set me up well to go and do that job for them.
Yeah.
But that was, I was only there for a year and a half before I moved to Austin. And I moved to Austin for just an absolute lifestyle change, right? It had nothing to do with my career.
Now, were you and Isabel, were y'all doing residential over there at all?
I was not ever.
She was, though.
Isabel was. She started working for CBRE, which is a big commercial brokerage. Yeah. And she ended up moving over into residential, and she did really well. And she had a lot more freedom. And the confluence of that freedom and that income and our desire just to get out of the Northeast. I mean, like I said, Philly, I grew up 2 hours away from college. I ended up working 45 minutes away from where I grew up. I was in this 2-hour bubble and I never left.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, she did leave. She's from Oklahoma, but most of her extended family is from Texas.
Yeah.
And so, for her, it was a little bit more of a homecoming, and it was, it was an easy sell. I mean, in fact, I think I'm probably the one that had to do more of the selling to move there.
Yeah.
But Austin's great. We don't have to spend a lot of time talking about why people want to move to Austin, right? Everybody knows why people want to move to Austin.
Yeah.
And 8 years ago, that was us. We wanted to move here. And without another job lined up, we said, well, I'll go sell real estate with you for a couple of years till we figure it out. And that's what we did for our first few years here.
Got you. And then, if I remember correctly, you got into representing home builders. Is that right?
A little bit. Actually, I was, representing my, first couple home builder deals when I got into my first deal as a principal, and it was basically because my buyer financing fell apart, but we had a good deal, and so I figured out like, well, maybe I take this contract from you. You don't lose your earnest money. Let's see if I can get an investor.
Yeah.
So I got an investor. This is to to this day is my main investor.
Yeah.
And I flipped a house.
Yep.
Right. And then I think I flipped another house, and then I tried to start building houses from the ground up and just kind of scaled up from there.
Yeah. So in 2020, if I remember correctly, you were putting out about, first of all, you guys, both you and Isabel joined Spyglass about,
2019.
And then in 2020, you pretty quickly kind of developed your own company, and you're building one spec house in 78704, probably completing about one a month. Is that correct?
It got to that point. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I started Urban ATX when I was, that was early 2018.
Okay.
Right. And so by the time I came over to Spyglass, we did grow quickly, and all of a sudden we had a pretty good listing inventory.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so at that point, the team of Isabel and me was really like, I had a good listing inventory through Urban ATX, and Isabel had her real estate sales business.
Right. And she started her team, and then, and so when how did you make the transition to doing mostly development?
Mm-hmm. So that also snowballed quickly.
Yeah.
There is for a lot of reasons, there's a big dividing line between single family and multifamily, right? The complexities of construction and project management, the capital required to do it. But on an entitlement standpoint, you can go to the city if you wanted to flip, or if you wanted to rebuild a house on an existing residential lot, and you just apply for a building permit, right? And it sounds flippant because a lot of people in Austin, are very unhappy with how difficult it is to get a building permit, and it is too difficult. But relatively speaking, that's a straightforward several month process.
Yeah.
When you go beyond that, so this would be basically anything more than a single house or a house in an ADU or a duplex, all of a sudden you need a site plan, which is, think about it, it's a building permit to develop the site infrastructure and all of the utilities and everything. And it requires heavy work from a civil engineer. It takes minimum a year, really, like 18 months.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a long pipeline. It's really long for someone who's been an infill builder relying on hard money to fund, these projects, high interest rates. The longer you hold it, the longer you pay. And so you can't really afford to acquire land with hard money and sit on it for a year and a half while you try to get approvals.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a different level of complication. And at that time, I sort of treated it as like a black box. Like I didn't want to go inside of site plan and see what you had to do. Right. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I was like, I can't touch that.
Yeah.
So I can't do anything more than 2 units. And then after a while, I, partly out of finding good deals and partly out of wanting to, I guess, growing a little bit bored of single family.
Sure.
We ended up acquiring a multifamily project.
Yeah, the one that was on Springdale a few years ago. Was that kind of your entry into?
It was.
Yeah.
And it was like a peek into that black box because I purchased it from another developer who was already about halfway through his site plan.
Yeah.
The civil engineer was already in place. The architecture was already in place. So we came in and we made a couple modifications. We changed the look of the architecture just a little bit. But that gave me a look inside of the site plan process without having to start from scratch with none of my own consultants and with none of my own experience doing it.
Yeah.
And from there, that's when I say it snowballs quickly. From there, it was like, okay, well, we'll do another one. And this time we're going to add the added complication of trying to rezone the property.
Yeah.
Right. And then we did another one.
That's called entitlement, right?
Yep.
Okay. And do you find that because it's a lot more complex, that gives you more of a niche that kind of makes it easier for you because it's harder you've got an expertise in this, right? It's harder than your textbook, building a home. Do you think that's an advantage for you?
It is. It's an advantage because it's a barrier to entry, right? And it's also entitlement is something that a lot of even big developers with all the capital in the world don't necessarily want to take on if they don't have to.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for that, honestly, is that the biggest developers, the primary objective really is putting money to work.
Gotcha.
right?
Okay.
And so if they can take something and everybody's got to go through site plan, right? I mean, it's rare that you pick up something midway through site plan or after site plan, but that's not what they necessarily call, that they refer to as entitlement risk. Entitlement risk is more about changing the zoning or getting approval to do what you need to be able to do, as opposed to just running through the site plan process to do what the zoning code currently allows you to do.
Yeah.
So that latter thing is not really the entitlement risk that they shy away from, but really they don't want to mess around with having to figure out how to rezone a property or to remove other development restrictions. They really want to get into something that they can deploy capital to quickly and turn it around.
Right. More turnkey.
Right.
So
the opportunity that gives us is that, especially because we're so concentrated in central Austin and we're only dealing with the idiosyncrasies of one municipality.
Yeah.
We're familiar with the neighborhoods, the properties, the zoning, the city. We're familiar with all of that stuff. It's easier for us to find a deal, understand what could be done here, and to swallow that risk and just say, we're going to go get this zoning changed. So we are in a better position to go into that development part, that vertical breaking ground construction part, with some sweat equity already built into our deal.
Gotcha. And it's a calculated risk because you've done it before, and you're not going to take a property that it's going to be super hard to change the zoning on it.
Right.
Yeah. So tell us about the proposed changes to the code that are likely going to happen. We know code next, whatever they call it now, is on the shelf, right? It's I think isn't it going to the Supreme Court, I heard?
I don't think it's going anywhere. It was shut down again at the appellate level.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, brief history of our code. It was designed in 1984 when the city of Austin looked much, much different than it does now.
Yeah.
And the prevailing political sentiment at the time was slow growth. Like, if we don't build it, they won't come.
Yeah.
Right. And that is still somewhat pervasive, and it's why we still have the code that we have, and we haven't been able to change it. But that has been pervasive in the face of the fact that it's undeniable at this point that we're in a serious housing crisis.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're just seeing some momentum appear now. But
didn't it get shut down because a group of homeowners filed lawsuits on it?
Right. The idea is, all right, so in 2012, I think it was 2012, City Council passed I'm going to get the wrong word, for lack of the appropriate word, like an initiative to direct staff to rewrite the zoning code, and then to give it back to City Council to debate it and pass it.
Yeah.
And so it took them all the way from 2012 to 2019 to get something that they could all agree on and pass. Yep. So it passed. Then it immediately was taken to court. And the basis of that lawsuit is a state law that basically says, it imagines basically a 200-foot deep donut around your site, right? And if you take up the square footage of that donut and you add up all of the neighbors, obviously if the city owns half of it because it's a road, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But the neighbors behind you, the neighbors on the sides of you, if 20% of the square footage of that donut is represented or owned by people who sign a petition against your rezone, it becomes what's called a valid petition, which triggers, and this is a state level law, it's not a city thing, right? But what it triggers is a requirement for a supermajority of city council to veto that petition. So in this case, 9 out of 11.
And we've never been even close to that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're at basically 7 pro-housing, 4 not so pro-housing.
Gotcha.
Right. And so we're not that far away, honestly. And so what this really is about is getting 2 other people on board with something that will ease our housing crisis in a way that they can stomach.
So it is progressing slowly, but it's progressing.
Right.
Right. And so, I know I've heard about from you and read about VMU2, vertical mixed use. Is that, tell us about what that is.
Okay, so vertical mixed use has been around since I think like the early 2000s or something. And it's a zoning overlay, which means you've got your base zoning, and that's, say it's commercial, and there's rules about how high you can build and how many square feet you can build. we use floor area ratio, right? Most people in real estate are familiar with FAR, floor area ratio, but that is the ratio of the square feet of your building to the square feet of your land, right? And it limits the size of your building. And there's all other kinds of restrictions. What vertical mixed use does is, in exchange for a couple things, making 10% of your units affordable to people who earn 60 or 80% of median income.
Yep.
And in addition to making like an attractive street front retail commercial space, you get a waiver from some of the restrictions like building setbacks, like FAR. And so you can build, in theory, a taller, denser building.
Okay. That's 2? Is that the second version of it?
That is the original.
Okay. What is 2?
2 is the idea that in exchange for a little more affordability, like say 12%, you can now go from whatever your initial height was, and I'm going to say 60 feet because the vast majority of zoning districts that this affects, the maximum height is 60 feet. And it gets you an additional 30 feet above that, so 90 feet.
Wow. Okay, so you can make room for those affordable units.
Right.
Yeah, and doesn't that have to be near a major or medium? I read it. Major or medium artery, like South Lamar or Guadalupe.
Right. Well, so originally the idea was this would apply to anything that was zoned VMU, and then there was a question of whether, if you're VMU, you inherit the right to choose VMU original or VMU 2, or if it becomes like a different zoning overlay where you would have to rezone from, say, regular VMU to VMU 2.
Yeah.
Now, what you're talking about with the larger and the medium corridors was prompted by a debate over the fact that we have something in Austin called compatibility setbacks, right? And this is the single biggest obstacle to developing more dense housing in the city of Austin.
Yeah.
Compatibility setbacks is the concept that you may be allowed to build up to 60 feet, but if you're right next door to a residential structure, then there's an additional limit on your height. And it's basically it's a diagonal graph.
Yeah.
So if you imagine for a minute, like if you had a graph with like a pretty shallow incline.
Yep.
Right. That would represent that it requires you to be further away from this single family.
Right. That's like why in this building, half of it can go to a certain amount.
Right.
And then the other half can go a floor further higher.
Right.
Because the second half is further away from housing than the first half.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is when you look at other cities that have this or some version of it, and you just look at other comparable cities, like you look at San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, obviously, and you want to look at Denver, Portland, Seattle, Atlanta, and to the extent that these cities also have compatibility setbacks, if you looked at that graphical representation of it, it's like vertical-ish.
Yeah.
The idea is that you can be much closer to this house and still have, your height.
Yeah. So they're being more cognizant of density and housing problems.
Right. So Austin is in the middle of one of the worst housing crises in the entire country, but we also have the most stringent compatibility setbacks in the entire country.
Yeah. So besides VMU2, as far as VMU2, is that approved yet, by the way?
It's one of those things where the council will pass an ordinance that directs staff to write an ordinance.
Oh, gosh.
That then they send back to city council. And I'm probably using the term ordinance wrong, but that idea.
Directive, whatever.
Yeah.
And so there's no timeline on when that could be done.
Well, I think it's due from staff in September.
Okay.
So
gotcha.
it's working.
Yeah.
The problem with it is that, that we got into the debate over, well, here's the problem. Great. You want to let us go up to 90 feet, but too many properties right now can't even get 60 feet. So what does this really do? Right. And so different advocates have.
Wait. So what do you mean too many properties can't even, or so many properties right now can't even get to 60 feet?
Right. Vertical mixed use properties whose maximum heights are 60 feet can't actually achieve 60 feet because of compatibility setbacks.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Right. It's a lot of them. And I'm going to get the percentages wrong, so don't hold me to it. But I wanted to say it's something like 34% of current VMU properties can get up to 60 feet, and some smaller amount, of course, would be able to get up to 90 feet. So what we're doing is we're taking on the housing crisis by passing an ordinance that functionally does very little.
Got you. Yeah, it's very selective of what pieces of land would work for that.
Right.
Are there any other proposals on the horizon for dealing with density problems?
Not a lot right now, because that was kind of the moment, right?
Yeah.
They're not gonna pick up the next day and talk about redoing it.
And so, do they realize about the compatibility issues?
Well, yeah. If you listen to the individual positions and comments of each of the council members, even the traditionally pro-neighborhood for council members, I mean, they are all on record saying they support more density on the corridors.
Yeah.
Right. And so they nudged a little bit to the point where they take this graph again, right? And they said, if you're doing this for housing, not for, say, an office building, at a certain distance away, if your graph is like here,
yeah,
you're going to be able to get a bonus. So you're above that graph.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is for larger corridors, 100 feet away from the triggering residential property. For medium corridors, it's 150 feet away.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and so what they're trying to do is compromise and say, okay, we don't want to totally get rid of compatibility so that you've got a 90-foot building next to a house.
Sure.
But we need to do something about it. The problem is it wasn't well calibrated.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, South First Street is my favorite example of a medium corridor. You've got 150 feet before you can get that density bonus. At 150 feet, you go from 3 stories or whatever it is straight up to 5 stories. The problem with that, though, is that you need to have enough depth in your lot to have a reasonably sized building, right? So what I always ballpark is, in order to have a reasonably efficient residential floor, you need about 70 feet of depth.
Oh, wow.
So if you add 70 and 150 together, you end up with the minimum lot depth in order to get 5 stories on a medium corridor effectively is 220 feet. And very few lots on South First Street are 220 feet deep. And the ones that are probably redeveloped already.
Yeah, because 30 years ago, it was mostly residential, not businesses.
Right.
Wow, that's interesting. Besides changing the code, well, I think that kind of answered this question, but what maybe you have a different answer. What are some of the things that city could do to help development easier for developers to bring more affordable housing to the market?
Yeah, I mean, again, the single biggest obstacle is compatibility.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like we can invest billions and billions of dollars in public transportation.
Yeah.
We can, I don't know, all of these things that are either extremely expensive and way far out or just like totally unfeasible.
Yeah.
Or we can get together and say we need to cut compatibility.
Yeah, at least from the major arteries. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer.
Right, that is the no-brainer. And, it's still, if you're in the middle of Barton Hills or whatever, and nobody's going to get a rezone to commercial.
Sure.
But, like, if they did, like, there's still compatibility. They're not going to build a 90-foot building in the middle of the neighborhood.
And I have a hard time believing that some of these people that object, their property values are through the roof. When you buy next to a busy, artery, you're going to have more traffic and more foot traffic. Just doesn't seem to make sense.
That's another example I make often is that I've got a property on a corridor zoned to VMU, but it's 100 feet deep.
Yeah.
Right. And so I basically can't do anything on it.
Yeah.
And the point I make is that 100 feet, I mean, that's not very far. I could stand in the middle of that corridor and you could stand on your residential property that's triggering my compatibility, and we could probably play a game of catch.
Yeah.
Right. So if you live that close to a major corridor, I mean, it kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah.
Right. You hear the traffic.
Yep.
Like you deal with the traffic.
Yeah.
You benefit from being able to walk all the way up and down that
right.
corridor. So like, why wouldn't you want?
Yeah, you're moving there because you want that urban atmosphere. I know maybe you have some holdouts that have been there for 30, 40 years, but if you're going to live a block from South Lamar, a block from Congress, if you choose to buy there now, it's because you want that. Like maybe you lived in New York and you want to be able to walk to restaurants and stuff.
Right. And we've got car washes like on South First Street, for
Yeah.
example, right? Taking up really great pieces of property very, very close to downtown Austin, like
Yeah.
walkable to downtown Austin.
Yeah.
And the effect of this sort of lack of real conviction on city council's part means that we're going to have car washes when it could be like, say, 5 stories of condos
Yeah.
with like a coffee shop and a restaurant down below you.
Yep.
You know, and as we fill up those corridors with great pedestrian oriented commercial space, as is required, as is will continue to be required,
Yeah.
we transform those corridors into something that's really nice, not
Yeah.
just car washes and dry cleaners.
Yeah. Or like an urban, walkable, nice environment with some portion of that is affordable for people that, you know, wait tables or artists or things like those lines, you know, instead of having them drive 30 minutes.
Right.
You've been written up in the Austin Business Journal. I know you're in the process of Reyna. First, tell us about that project.
Sure. Reyna it's a 16 unit townhome development. You know, we've got other projects that I would love to talk about that are much bigger and have a much more affordability component.
Yeah.
But what this one is a very large piece of residential zone property, you know, right off of South Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And so we saw an opportunity. We got an acre and a half of single family zoning. What are we going to do with that? Can we subdivide it and split it up into a couple different lots? I mean, there's something we can do there. And what we landed on is the idea of, well, we asked for a rezone to a very light multifamily zoning. In fact, it's called SF6, where the SF sounds for single family, right? So it's like the lowest level where you can get more than basically 2 units.
Yeah.
And what it allows for is, to oversimplify, basically at 12 units per acre.
Yeah.
And so we're able to get 16 units there. You know, the neighborhood had some concerns about the density and the traffic and whatnot. And, you know, we were able to argue that, well, you know, look, if you allow us this rezoning, we're going to create something that fits within the character of the neighborhood, like smaller houses, many of them detached, some of them are duplexes.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it'll fit in.
Yeah.
The alternative is, you know, one gigantic house that's not economically feasible.
Right.
Or a subdivision where, you know, your neighbors are going to be all on top of you.
Yeah, but this is a prime example of an acre and a half where if compatibility wasn't an issue, you would be able to put how many units there on a VMU, VMU2?
Right, sure. And it's, you know, it might be a hard case to argue that VMU is appropriate for that thing because it's off of South Congress.
Yeah.
And so it is almost getting to be like in the neighborhood.
Gotcha.
But yeah, in the absence of compatibility, it would probably be an argument to be made that this should be a denser community.
Yeah.
And again, that would have helped our housing crisis more because we
Yeah.
went from one lot that was, the lot value was worth multiple millions of dollars and would have, you know, ended up with a few or one extremely expensive housing unit to 16, which they're expensive still, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're above, you know, the median housing price in Austin to start, and then some of them go into the millions. But for South Congress, that's not that expensive.
No.
And so at least, you know, it doesn't necessarily provide truly affordable housing, but at least we're breaking up one lot into 16 units. Each of them are smaller and therefore less expensive than they would be.
Yeah. So, okay, tell me about the other projects you have on the horizon. 1200 Springdale and 1418 Frontier Valley.
Mm-hmm. Those are both apartment buildings for which we're utilizing a development bonus called Affordability Unlocked.
Okay.
And so Affordability Unlocked is the one tool that really applies citywide, like, you know, as opposed to being in downtown Austin, where you get a waiver from compatibility setbacks.
Oh, wow.
You also get a height bonus. You also get a waiver from FAR and all kinds of things.
Gotcha. And how much of these have to be affordable?
50%.
50%. Okay.
So it is a sledgehammer of a development bonus, and it is a sledgehammer of an affordability component. 50% affordable at 60% of median income.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And I think that's great for a number of reasons. But it doesn't work in a lot of cases, right? You have to have something else going on. Like,
yeah, you have to be able to make up the money to be able to, you know.
For example, you need to have very cheap land.
Mm-hmm.
which on South First Street you're not going to get.
Yep.
And typically you need something else, right? There are ways to, you can get excuse me, a property tax abatement for offering that level of affordable units. So you start to layer that in on top of the development bonus, and the deal starts to make economic sense.
Yeah.
Right. Typically, just straight up on its own, it wouldn't work. But in the case of 1418 Frontier Valley, it's a 101 unit apartment building.
Wow.
And it is going to go on a vacant piece of land that is zoned for mobile homes.
Okay.
It's in a part of town where it's notoriously difficult to get a rezone. It probably would not have been something we would have tried, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But what Affordability Unlocked allows you to do, among all these other things, is put an apartment building on pieces of property that aren't necessarily already zoned for apartments.
Gotcha.
So in that case, we have dirt cheap land,
Mm-hmm.
and we have the opportunity to get a property tax abatement. And when you combine those two things together, we have a viable deal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really great success because it's viable. It's financed, by the way, all with private funding, right? There's no like federal tax credits or local government bond money being used.
Yeah. So it doesn't cost the government anything.
Right. We're talking about, and this is something that doesn't get talked about enough, but this is private capital being deployed to provide affordable housing. And by the way, the other half of the units that are not affordable, well, they're also not that expensive.
Right.
They're merely less expensive. They're just not formally rent controlled.
Yeah.
So we are really in for one little piece of property that was meant to be a mobile home park. We are offering a good amount of density that is much, much needed. And it's like right off of East Riverside. It's like where it needs to be.
Oh, wow. That's off of East Riverside. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Yep.
And what about 1418 Frontier Valley?
That was that one.
That was that
so
one.
1200 Springdale is also an Affordability Unlocked project.
Yeah.
That one, we chose to do Affordability Unlocked there mainly because of compatibility setbacks.
Okay.
Whereas on Frontier Valley, yes, we needed the relief from compatibility setbacks, but we also needed the ability to develop apartments on mobile home zoning.
Yeah.
This one, we had the zoning, we had too much compatibility. The land was expensive. We couldn't build enough units
Mm-hmm.
with compatibility setbacks to have a viable deal. So there you go. There's a big piece of land on a major intersection
Yep.
that was not viable for apartments because of
Compatibility.
compatibility.
All about compatibility. Right.
So you get rid of compatibility, and we've got 384 units,
Uh-huh.
right? And
Wow.
half of those, so
That's
100,
awesome.
184 or whatever.
So you're really taking single-handedly, it says single-handedly, your company is taking a really big bite into the affordability crisis.
Yeah, I mean, we're for two projects for one small new company. I think I'm pretty proud of that. I'm very proud of that. It takes a lot more than that, right? I mean,
Sure.
When you look at going back to a little bit more political stuff, if we have time, but
Sure.
In 2017, the city created what they call the Strategic Housing Blueprint.
Yeah.
And it called for, I'm going to get my numbers wrong again, but it's like 130,000 new units over 10
Yeah, I just read
years,
that. Yeah.
right? And there's this nice little pie graph included there that shows what portion of them are meant to be, very deeply affordable, like 30%.
Yeah.
And which portion of them are meant to be, under 60%, which is moderately affordable. And
Yep.
under 80%, and then
80. There's some percentage of median.
income,
Yeah.
right. And then when you think about it, we also need to add housing for people whose median incomes are, say, between 80 and 120%,
Yeah.
right? And over 80%, there are no public financing options to support that.
Yeah.
Yet that's needed. That's workforce housing. That's like nurses, teachers,
Yeah.
police, firefighters. And we've created this city that, because of our zoning code, is absolutely exclusionary to those types
Yeah.
of careers. They have to live like way in the suburbs.
Yeah.
You have to live in Buda to be a teacher in Austin,
It's insane.
right? And so we need a lot more of that. And there aren't many tools
Yeah.
directed at that. Whereas Affordability Unlocked is basically the one tool we have.
Right. And you hit the nail on the head is that you're tackling this from private funding, right? You're not having government subsidies and government housing. This is like, capitalism coming to the rescue at one of the best case uses of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, Affordability Unlocks like a 28-page ordinance that was passed. I use the term bipartisanship to mean, in this case, pro-housing and pro-neighborhood.
Right.
Right. It was bipartisan. Everybody loved it. Everybody, gave themselves a big pat on the back for doing it. And I don't understand well enough to know that maybe Affordability Unlocked would, in the form that it was passed, would not be viable today politically because we're in the wake of the rezone that was shot down.
Yeah.
Maybe it had to be the fact that it came before that. But, to answer the question that I got from you and that I get a lot is what else can we be doing? Well, if we are able to somehow pass a development bonus that doesn't cause problems with this notification requirement for valid petitions and whatnot, if that's something that we can do, why are we not doing more of that?
Explain that again. It doesn't cause a problem with notifications.
Okay, well, we probably skipped over a little bit of the lawsuit stuff.
Yeah.
Right? I explained that the lawsuit was a result of this issue that neighbors could do a valid petition, right? And what the lawsuit claimed is that changing the zoning code amounts to rezoning everybody's property, which effectively means the city would have had to notify every single neighbor, every single house in the city of Austin, every single property in Austin, right? And of course they didn't do that in the way that's required, like paper notifications about their pending zoning change.
Yeah.
And so in the wake of that, the current council, and again, I think that this is wrong-headed. I think we need to be more bold than this, but the current council is really set on like a 9-2 consensus, right? We're not going to pass anything that we can't do 9-2, because then it's just going to have the same problem. It's going to get shot down because we didn't notify everybody. If you've got 9-2, you're protected from that.
Gotcha. And so now this whole lawsuit is triggered because of a state, what is it, ordinance or law?
It's a state law,
State law. What is the state doing about this? The state's done a good job of, stepping in when they're, depending on how you look at it, but some of the things were unreasonable. Some of them were reasonable, like, the Uber tax and all that, when they had that issue. It seems to me that the state should get more involved, that's what's triggering a density problem in Austin, and it's their law that is triggering that problem.
Yeah. I mean, they may be working on something. If they are, I'm not, informed on it. But I've heard about proposals coming from the Biden administration about programs that supply money to municipalities who change their land use codes in a way that promotes more affordable housing. Right?
Yeah.
And so maybe Texas will kind of catch on to that and work on something. Or I don't know, maybe the city of Austin will just, it's getting worse very fast, right? We've seen a slowdown in the market, right, because of interest rates and whatnot. But
which pushes lower cost buyers out anyway.
Right. It's only affordability is not going to get better because of a recession, right? And it's going to just continue to get worse when the economy comes out of a recession. Austin is just going to get more expensive because of an imbalance of supply and demand. And so it's hard to imagine that we already haven't reached the point where it's just unconscionable not to do enough about this. But I guess if we haven't reached that point yet, at some point we will. Yeah, we got to get our. I guess that means it's getting worse before it gets better. Like the alcoholics, reach our rock bottom. Well, this has been the most interesting conversation I've had about affordability and zoning in Austin, and I appreciate you being on here. If people want to get in touch with you or they want to see what you're up to, what's the best thing to do? Go to your website. Yeah, go to our website. Hartford, I keep saying that, heartwoodre.com. Right. I could see, after watching, if the press wanted to watch this, you'd be a good candidate to talk to. So, well, awesome, Chris. Thanks for coming in. Thank you. All right.